Like I said, this is communication studies, and this is our third chapter. At any point and you have any questions and you want to stop me, you can go right ahead. I do not mind. So diving straight into it, as I said, this is writing for academic purposes. So this is very much going to talk about expository writing, and I would have covered that in chapter 2. Anyways, the first thing I want to talk about is gathering information. So before doing any type of academic writing, one needs to first conduct research. And this is usually going to be seen in, let's say, when you're doing essays for school and you have topics like, whenever you hear topics about something in the Caribbean, cause and effects of this and that, usually at this stage you're required now to do some academic, and not just normal research, but academic research before you write. So you're required to actually state facts rather than your opinion. There are two ways when you're gathering information. There are primary sources and there are secondary sources. Usually the one that you're going to use most often will be secondary sources, but primary sources are those that are first-hand accounts or objects that were created during the period under investigation. And what that means initially is, let's say you were writing about violence in the community or something like that, and then you actually decided that you were going to do a survey to see how your peers perceive violence in their communities. So you would, let's say, do a survey of about 20 people at your school, and you interview them and ask questions, and they would give you their idea about or how prominent they think that violence is in their community. That would be a primary source because you got it directly, or it was created as a first-hand account for this investigation, or your way of gathering information to write this piece about violence. On the other hand, now, secondary sources, this is either writings about the primary source or the writings from research that was already done. So when you get research, like going back to the same example with the surveys, when you get research from your participants or your peers, and then you write about that research, that writing that you've done on that research is actually now secondary data because it no longer comes from the primary source, which, if you were a scientist, would be the experiment or what have you. And also another and the most common way to get secondary information is to look towards writing or research that was already done. So if you're doing a question on violence in Barbados or the Caribbean, then you would go online and search for information from a credible source, and you will get into the credibility, reliability, and validity and all that later on. But you will go and make sure that it's from a credible source or a reliable source, and also valid. Have to use all three words again. But you go and get it from and make sure that this person who did it, they didn't do it under any bias. We'll also cover that later on in this chapter. But you have to make sure that it is solid research that was done and it answers the question that you're trying to write on. Again, with the example of violence, you would get that information and then use that in your writing. I also wondering if further on in the chapters they actually teach you about citing work from these persons, but you'll get to that eventually, I suppose. I'm not that many slides ahead, so I can't say for sure. So, evaluation. This is after you, for example, you found your secondary source on the internet, on the web, what have you, whether it be a journal article, a website, experiment that was done that you want to make reference to. It could even be a video from YouTube. But when you found your source, your secondary source, more than likely it's going to be a secondary source. When you found it, you have to then evaluate it. So when evaluating sources, it's important to note these 6 things. The authority, we're going to talk about what that is in a second. The reliability, the validity, whether there's a bias or not. You're also going to have to make sure that it's not on opinion, but rather it's factual. And we'll get into what all of these things mean and even how to apply it to your own academic writing. So we first deal with authority. And this refers to whether the author of the research you have found can be considered an expert in the area you are trying to write on. For example, if I were writing about psychological effects of violence, and I'm using violence all the time because it's a topic I've recently had a lot of dealings with. Um, so it's just in the forefront of my brain right now. But let's say you were doing about the psychological impact of violence, and then you find some research about the psychological impact, but it's not done by a psychologist. Then you can't use that as academic research because that person is not, I don't want to say authorized, but they don't have necessary authority, or they're not an expert in the area that you're trying to write on. You're writing on psychological impact, and yet this person is not a psychologist. So I would say that that might not be as reliable or as valid as if it was from an authoritative source. So, has the person conducted extensive research? Let's say this person is a psychologist, but they just wrote an article that maybe might be their hypothesis for later research. So it's their opinion. They haven't conducted any research on it, so they don't know the psychological impact. They're just saying from their experience, and even though they are an authoritative figure or an expert in the area, they are still writing based on their opinion. So you have to make sure that this person has first conducted research, so they're referring it to either secondary sources as well, or maybe they did their own primary research and have straight information from the primary source. Lastly, considering authoritative research for your research when writing, okay, oh sorry, that's very arbitrary, but what I was basically saying there is that, what I've said already, which is make sure that when you are researching to write something for your academic pieces, that you make sure it's from authoritative search, or the person has the authority to write on it, and then you hereby writing it would make it valid. I had a point I wanted to make, but I think it just slipped my mind. Yeah, it definitely did. Alright, I'll continue, it might come back. So the next thing we have to deal with here is the reliability. Now, the reliability of your work is not only research you carry out, the reliability of your work, you not only research but carry out yourself. I really have to work better on my slides. Anyways, it's very important. Cut that. It's very important. The reliability of research must always be tested. So the great ways, I have 3 great questions to answer when you're testing the reliability of your research. What language was used? Are there too many emotive words? And this definitely reminds me of the point I wanted to make before. Usually when it comes to academic writing, one thing you want to stay away from is a lot of narrative writing in it, or the other modes of writing. And if you want to learn more about these modes of writing, I ask that you go and watch the recording on chapter 2, because they talk all about the different modes of writing and how they're used and when they should be used and stuff like that.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes, please.
In regards to where to go to get the recordings, where are they?
You're going to have to give me a second to get back to you. What I'll do is I'll ask, because I usually just send them in, but I'm not exactly sure. I know they go to a YouTube page, but I don't know the name. Maybe you do, but it goes to a YouTube page. I'll have to find and give you that at a later
Okay.
date. So if you come back next week, or I'll actually put it in the chat when I post these slides. I'll say you can find the recording for 2 here and here, and you will see the information in the chat.
Okay.
Alright. So, right, just be careful with the language you use, making sure that there are not too many emotive words. In an academic piece, you really try to shy away from words that appeal to the person's emotion. And I can't think of any examples off rip, but I know I was writing something today, and I had the urge to write a fancy word, like a little big word, because I was like, I know this word, and this suits well here. But then I thought about it, and I was like, no, this is an academic piece. And putting in that word is more persuasive writing, and it will more appeal to the reader's emotion. But I'm writing an academic piece which is more based on facts and just saying things as they are without your bias or your opinion. Alright? Your opinion can be put in there too, but it has to be very obvious that yes, I'm writing my opinion in this part, but I'm relating it to facts. Alright? But not just writing it somewhere along where you're writing in the facts to try to bring the reader's attention more to that part. Academic writing stays very true. The next thing you can do, or next question you can ask, is what is the purpose of the research? Is it to inform or to persuade? Okay? So sometimes you will go and you will find an academic piece, well not academic piece, but you will find some research, whether it be from an authoritative, even if it's from an authoritative, I won't say source, but I don't know if it's actually grammatically correct to say that, but whether it's from authoritative source, then you have to find out again, is this the person trying to persuade me of something, or is this to inform? Have they done the valid research necessary to speak on this topic? So this is again about the reliability of it. Alright? Sometimes, a lot of times, like blogs especially, is not a good idea to get your information from blogs for academic pieces, because blogs are usually used for that. Even though it's an authoritative person, they have a doctorate or what have you, they're qualified to speak on the topic. But on their in their blogs, they usually would use more a persuasive speech, because they're trying to get you to like kind of come to their side, believe it from their point of view, so you'd be more interested to continue reading their work. So there is a sense of persuasion in it. All right. So asking yourself whether it's to inform or to persuade is another really good way of identifying whether it's reliable or not. And question 3, has the author used facts and evidence to come to the conclusion? I would have alluded to this before, and all it means is seeing, you can check the references page a lot of times on a source, and if they have references from other, textbooks and stuff like that, then you know, hey, they're writing based on evidence. Or if there's a more like experimental piece where they had a hypothesis and then they prove it, saying that, I did these surveys, or after the research this is what the case is, then you know, hey, okay, good, this is reliable, alright, because it's based on facts and evidence. So moving on along, hope you've got that. In terms of reliability, I think I moved to validity next. Yes, I do. So validity now is understanding the validity side of an argument is also important. And remember, I'm looking at this from two ways. I'm looking at this not only when writing your own work, but seeing it in others' work and knowing if you can use it as part of yours. Alright? So let us look at a valid and an invalid argument. So this one is more towards the way you write it, as opposed to seeing it in other writing as well, although it can be seen there too. But here goes. This is an example of valid. A valid hypothesis, a valid premise, and then a valid conclusion. So my first premise is, in order to win the race, I must train hard. Alright? In order to win the race, I must train hard. My second premise, or my minor premise, is that I won the race. Okay? So then my conclusion is, I must have trained hard. And I really need to get this, because there's a slight difference between whether it's valid or it's going to be invalid. So again, check the order in which they come. My first premise is, in order to win the race, I must train hard. So if I've won the race, it means I must have trained hard. That is a valid premise into conclusion. Invalid now is where I have the same premise, in order to win the race, I must train hard. Then I say I train hard, and then my conclusion is I won the race. That is, it's written in that set, this statement is invalid. Alright? Why it is because it said, in order to win the race, I must train hard. Right? But it didn't say that if I train hard, I will win the race. You see the slight difference there. And this is a very subtle example. And usually this is the way that it comes. So it's hard to identify, I get it. Let me see if I can give you another example. But this one obviously is verbal. I don't have any more on screen. But let's say, in order for my car to start, it must have at least some gasoline. So then my premise after that is my car starts, which means that my conclusion is my car must have at least some gasoline. Alright? So the car starts, which means it had at least some gasoline. But I can't switch it around and say, in order for my car to start, it must have at least some gasoline, and then my second premise to be, my car has some gasoline, my car will start. Okay? And again, it's for the same reason. The first premise does not say that if your car has at least some gasoline, it will start. The same way that in this one on screen, it doesn't say, if I train hard, I will win the race. It just says, in order to win the race, I must train hard. But I assume that other people train hard as well. So training hard does not guarantee me winning the race. So I can't conclude and say, if I train hard, I won the race. And I hope that is well explained, because I tried my best there. Um, so that is in terms of validity. I think now we move on to bias. Yes. So bias. We must be careful to keep biases out of our writing and research, as well as be able to identify it in secondary sources. Um, Sometimes bias as well is very subtle, and sometimes we miss it. Anywho, to ensure the validity, the research must guard against biases. So not only you as a person who, let's say you have a topic to write on, and again I can fall back on violence, but let's say you have to write on the impact of media violence um, in, let's just say, Barbados, keep it close. The impact of media violence in Barbados, and you have a very strong feeling about this, and you think that, oh my gosh, media violence definitely impacts like violence in Barbados. Like it's because the children playing too much Call of Duty, and you have a very strong opinion on it, but you're writing on this topic. Let's say now you go and you start looking at research, and some of the research say that violence in the media does not necessarily guarantee a person will be violent, and you kind of disregard that information until you find ones that match what you think. All right, that is a bias, and a lot of times we do that. Um, I myself, I probably can say that I've done that before, because I wanted my writing to go in a certain direction, so I looked for the research that matched what I was saying, right? And that is a bias. So it's biases like that. There's really good examples to show us how easily bias can creep into research or work that we write or do. Lastly, biases are inclinations we might have when conducting research, and I just basically explain that. There are obviously a lot of other biases, and a lot of times I remember I was reading a set of research, and this is a very controversial topic, but I was doing an essay on, I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was something where it was kind of masculinity in a sense versus femininity. That's a word. I'm not even entirely sure, but it was between basically making a comparison between males and females, and I was doing research for it to write on it, and I remember reading a piece that was written by a lady. No offense to the feminists out there, but I was reading her research, and she had the authority. Um, it was also reliable. It was also valid. Everything was good. But I remember just reading the research, and only partway through it hit me. I was like, why is this research persuading me? It's not that I'm just reading facts and saying, okay, believe this to be true, but it was persuading me. And then after a bit more research, I realized that she was a feminist, and there's a lot of controversy behind the work that she actually does. And I was like, oh boy, I can't use this because she's arguing, even though yes, she has the evidence and stuff on the research. You can tell that there's a bias that went into doing the research. So even though yes, she has the facts and everything to prove it after doing her research, it's still biased because I can imagine that she went out of her way to get these responses or to get it set up the way that it was, right? So I didn't necessarily use it. I actually did use it, but it completely turned the way that I was writing the piece. But that's just a real life example I have, and also examples that I find are very prominent. But biases they're really easy to miss sometimes. So just be very careful when you're writing your work. Once it's an academic piece, just stay very factual and kind of keep your own personal feelings out of the work. So now we move on to opinions, and I'm pretty sure you know what opinions and facts are, so I won't dilly-dally too long on this part. Um, but not all opinions are bad, though, which is something that you may not be aware of. In fact, an opinion is usually the start of a hypothesis, which is also the start of research. So an opinion might have some truth and is, wow, not me using WhatsApp language, and is just waiting to be verified. I feel this is something that I'm going to miss, so I'd like if you just give me a chance to correct it, because when I don't want 40 slides with that. Okay, next. So what I mean when I say opinions are not bad is no solid research is ever just based on a fact, like a straight up fact. There are only a few things in life that are straight up facts, like all humans die. That's a straight up fact. There's no need, no opinion or anything that needs to first come out of it for that to be proven, right? We see this every day. We know that at a certain age you eventually die. Once you're human, you die. That's a fact. But not all facts are that, like, like out there, obvious and things to us. So it actually takes opinions on what we believe to be right or wrong, to form a hypothesis which we then prove to be either incorrect or correct. And sometimes they are. So opinions are not always bad, right? It's just that before you write an opinion, or when you're writing an opinion, you always let the reader know, hey, this is an opinion that I had. And then, so it's either you either disclaim it, or you either use the opinion to then prove further along in your writings that that started as this being an opinion, but now you can see how this is in fact, because they brought in other evidence to prove my opinion. Alright? So that's how opinions are used in academic writing, because people would assume, well, I can't put my opinion in it then, because it's an academic writing, but that's not necessarily true. Alright? And moving on lastly to the last thing, I think that, yeah, this is the last thing, is a fact. So facts that we think are facts aren't always facts. So I'm going the very contrary devil's advocate way here, where some facts are just social constructs. And I really hope I have a good example because I cannot remember. A social construct is a practice or concept that a group shares, whether it be common values, beliefs, and customs. So for example, there might be something in Barbados that we all believe as Barbadians to be true, but in other parts of the world it is not. So within that group, some truths are deemed indisputable facts, basically what I just said. And on the flip side, these said truths are not accepted by other groups. And I did not have an opinion. I knew that when I was, sorry, I did not have an example. I knew that when I was writing it, I couldn't think of one. But let me see if I can now. So it's basically when a group has an idea or a shared value, something that they believe to be a fact, but other people outside that group do not think is true. And I can make a really shaky example here, and I ask you to bear with me and probably think of a better one given the definition here. But we also, what I can say is, or the best example I can think of is that some groups have ideas about other groups that that group perceives to be a fact, but when in actual truth is not a fact. And I'm going really loosely on this example here. And that is, for example, people say, like, let's say, oh gosh, this is controversial, but let's say a group of Caucasian people think that all black people like fried chicken and watermelon, which is not true, but to them that's a fact. And I'm going really loosely on that, but that's the only example I could think of off rip or off the bat. So, but it's things like that we do believe to be a fact, but aren't. Even superstitions, for example. The older generation believes that if you open a black umbrella in the house, then you will bring duppies. They really do believe that to be a fact. In that group or that older generation, that's a fact. There's no disputing it. But us, the younger generation, some of us do, but a lot of us don't believe that to be a fact. So facts aren't always facts, I suppose, is what this is trying to say. So sometimes, again, you have to be wary of this coming up in your work, in the sense of you'll be writing something, but you're writing it based on a particular subgroup, and you're writing it as a fact, but it isn't. Still can't think of a good example, but I'll see if I can post one along with the notes at a further date. So, along with the slides, sorry. Now I want to move on. So remember I started off, because I said it here, folks, but remember I started off just with, what did I title it? I started off with the different type of sources, primary and secondary data, and then I went into saying the 6 different ways that you can test the data, which was the authority, the reliability, the validity, the bias, and opinion and fact. So I'm done with that section. I want to move on. I'm still talking about academic writing, but I want to talk about the way that we collect data. Collecting data is, of course, an integral part of the research, and there are 2 ways of collecting data. and this is for primary sources. Secondary sources is already done. Um, you don't necessarily have to collect data in this manner. But if you were doing a primary collection or looking for primary source, then this is the two data collection methods. You have quantitative and you have qualitative. So the best thing I can do right now is just read here what's on the screen. So quantitative is involving numbers. It can be counted or measured and are given numerical values. So it could be in centimeters or dollars. The data that you collect would come in that form. Well, quantitative data can come in that form. It could come in just units, centimeters, dollars, etc. You would mainly find that with like surveys. Surveys is a quantitative method of collecting data because you get back. For example, let's say you send out 100. My phone is going off. Let me think. Suppose you send out 100 surveys. The first thing that you would do to segment the data, or the way that will come back to you, because usually what you do is you put these in like software. Let me see if I can think of one. SPPP or PPSP, something like that. But there's a software that you put it in, and it would generate like tables and stuff on the data. So, for example, if I send 100, it would say that 25 of them, because you know how you send out surveys, you first ask your gender, then your age, because you're trying to sub group into certain demographics, whether it be age, gender, and then you will see how those two demographics pair up with the rest of the questions on the survey. So first of all, the survey would say, well, you sent 100, 25% were males, 75% were females, and then you would see how much of the females answer yes to a certain question, you would see how much of the males answer no to a certain question, and that's if you trying to get the data to come back in the sense of male versus female. It could come back in the sense of older people versus the younger people, so then the data will tell you how much of them were between 25 and older, and how much were 25 and younger, and then what them say to the different questions you answer in the survey, and then you will get a rough tables and charts or whatever you want to create with the same software, and it comes, as I said, in a numerical value. It could come in just units. You can even do it and manipulate in a way that comes out in money, because the research could be about money, etc. I feel like I'm rambling on, so I'll just move to the next. So for qualitative now, quantitative could also be experiments as well too. I just want to add that in there. So like experiments, surveys, and then qualitative is more things like documentaries or interviews is also qualitative. So in these ones, it cannot be counted. There's no really numerical value coming out of it. It is more express the subjective and interpretive qualities of the item or process. And by this way, mean is you actually get data, more in-depth data about what that person or specific subgroup that you decide to do the documentary on or the interview on. You get really focused data, but you can't. But the drawback of qualitative is that you can't say that, oh, because of this research I did on these subgroup of people in these set of interviews here, that it is a measure of what everybody else has to say. But when you do a more quantitative one, which would include a lot more people, then you can say, well, this is the general consensus. So that's a disadvantage and advantage between the two of them right there. So if you want just more in-depth data from a subgroup, then you would do the qualitative. So if you want to find out what the general population thinks, then you would do quantitative. Yeah, that's about it for that. So I'm still talking about continuation. Oh, I did cover this just now. I didn't even know I had this slide in here. But basically, as I said, survey and experiment for qualitative. Observation. Oh, that's another good way to collect qualitative data. You can just observe certain actions. It could also be quantitative too, because, for example, companies do this a lot. Like big companies that want to for like advertising and stuff, they might send out somebody to a certain location. Let's use Barbados for example. I would send out somebody to a certain location in Barbados to count just how many cars pass during the day, so I would know if that's a good place to put a billboard to advertise my company. Because it don't make sense putting my sign or whatever where a lot of cars don't pass. So go and get somebody to count at this location, go to another location and count the cars that pass, and maybe a third location, then see which location the more cars pass in say a week's time, and then it will say, okay, yes, it's worth going and spend all this money printing this and putting it up here because a lot of people can see it. Alright? So observation could become quantitative data because then that person just counting cars, and when you get it back, you can get in a number, which is quantitative. But observation can definitely be qualitative. Say you're observing how two different children from two different families react to different toys or something like that, then that's not qualitative. It's just you basically seeing their raw reactions, and that would be qualitative. So observations and documentaries, and then I already gave the advantage and the disadvantage for both earlier when I said that quantitative is, you get a broader picture of the entire population or entire subgroup even, and then for qualitative you get a more in-depth idea about how a certain subgroup feels about whatever it is you're researching. Alright, moving on smartly now, we move to the 5 steps to writing academic pieces. So we've talked about everything we need to get or to make sure it's in order before we start it. Now I'm actually going to talk about how to write it. Alright? So for essays or research papers, most of the time that's what you're going to be doing. Your step 1 is to analyze the question. Step 2 is to research. We talked a lot about research, so I won't go through that much. Step 3 is to plan. Step 4 is to write. And step 5 is to edit. And I think I'll give you a little review on what each part, all 5 parts, entail a bit more in depth. So, analyzing the question. When you analyzing the question, there's 3 things that I have here that you should do. Look carefully at the topic heading or question, which is wherever you were given, because a lot of times you get into the stage now where you don't just get a topic which is a day at the beach or the impact of hurricanes. You get something where it's almost 2 sentences long telling you what they want you to write on. Right? So when you look at it carefully, first of all, identify the directive words. By directive words, it means the words that say, basically saying, do this, or this is what I want to be done. To get a clear understanding of what you must do. And then lastly, if you need to research the meaning of any words in that, do that, because you really want to get a full understanding of what it's asking you to do. So I have an example here. It says compare and contrast the differences in the way we communicate in the Caribbean. Alright? Terrible topic by the way. But as you can see, I have certain words on the line. And these are the very important words that really convey the meaning of what it is I'm trying to ask you to write on. So I first want you to compare and as well contrast. Those are the directive words. Compare and contrast. So you know this is a compare and contrast essay. And then it's not the similarities, but it said the differences. So that's the next word. In the way, not in how, not in where, in the way we communicate. Not how we drink water or sip tea, but in the way we communicate in the Caribbean. Not in the world, in the Caribbean. So if you pick out those specific words that I do to, you would see the meaning becomes very clear of what it is that it's actually do. And I would say I didn't think this was going to be so helpful, but it was very, very helpful for me, especially if you have to do Caribbean studies later on. It's very helpful to understand what the question was asking, especially for Caribbean studies. I didn't struggle with it so much with communication, but it did for Caribbean studies, though it would be very helpful in both areas. Make sure you break down your question first and understand it. Let's say, for instance, you didn't understand what the word compare meant, then you look up the definition of compare to make sure you understand. And next we have plan the essay, which I think was step 2. So this refers to making the points and subpoints for all the paragraphs you are going to write. So I hope by now, I really do hope by now that you plan an essay before you actually write it. So I hope that you say, this is my topic, this is what I want to write about in the first paragraph, this is what I want to be the introduction basically, then you say this is what I want to be my 3 main points, my 3 paragraphs in the middle, and then you say this is what I want to conclude by saying. and you literally write out those as your big main points, and then I would hope that you break it down further and you subdivide that specific head topic that you have into smaller groups in ways to finish the paragraph. Because you're not just going to write, man, I writing about hurricanes in the first paragraph. I want to write about the wind. Second paragraph, I want to write about the wind. Third paragraph, I want to write about the, well, let's say you introduce, and then these are your main points in the middle. I want to write about the wind, then the rain, then the effect that hurricanes have, and then I want to conclude by saying they're dangerous, and then just start writing your essay after that. No, you have to break down the points. So in the points about the wind in the hurricane, you want to say, it's only a hurricane when it gets to this amount of this like 100 miles per hour. Before that is a storm. You want to talk about the development, so not just the wind, but how the numbers vary in terms of category 1, category 2, 4, 5, whatever hurricane. Then about your rain, you want to talk about how much rain it could drop. It could drop from say 2 meters to 10 meters in rain, and you want to talk about the fact that most of the rain is found in the back half of the hurricane because it's for about the water, and you have sub points on the just rain, So that's how you plan an essay, alright? And it was not that important before to plan your little narratives, those short stories and stuff like that, but it is very important in your academic work to plan it, because you don't want it to sound choppy, because you're going to lose the reader, and then the information is not going to be clear. So I probably covered everything I have here on the slide. Make sure that they are in a systematic order. I just talked about that, and that they flow so you do not confuse the reader. And also paragraphing, and talked about all of that. Lovely. So step 3, which is to actually write the essay now. All right. Although I think research was before. Hold on, is research? Did I do research? Oh no, let's skip research because we talked about that before time. Okay, so let me just double check. Yeah. So writing the essay, you're actually going to write it now. So once you have the outline properly thought out, you can then begin to write, expanding on the points as you go. So even the sub-points, you expand on those, okay? So even the sub-points I would have mentioned when I talk about the little hurricane example, about category 1, category 2, you say something about what it means to be category 1. Say something about what it means to be category 2. So you expand on those points as you go. Remember the first sentence. This is very important. Even I was correcting essays for essay competition recently, and people got marked down because they did not have topic sentences, and that was 15 to 17, right? Anyways, remember the first sentence of every paragraph is a topic sentence, and should let the reader know what that paragraph will be about. Always have a topic sentence. So see that main point that you have for every paragraph that I mentioned before, that main point, that's how you should start your paragraph with. That's really what you should start your paragraph with. So we know what's coming. So again, with the same hurricane example, if in my paragraph 2 I want to talk about the winds of the hurricane, I would say, well, I hate to hear it started like this, but I can't think of nothing better right now. But I would say, the winds of a hurricane can range from da-da-da-da-da to da-da-da-da-da, and then I go on to talk about it further. And for the next one, I can say, the rain of the hurricane, they can be this amount, da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da. Point is, every time you start that new paragraph, I should know from the first sentence what that paragraph is going to be about. Another thing to note is your introductory paragraph and concluding paragraphs. Those are 2 really important paragraphs. Even, yes, your introductory paragraph will have a topic sentence, but the topic sentence for your introductory paragraph is not necessarily about what that introductory paragraph is going to be about, like the rest of them. So like how I say paragraph 2, if it was about the wind, you would say talk about the wind in the first sentence? No. What your first paragraph topic sentence is what the entire essay will be about. So you almost write I don't want to say a summary, because a summary is the conclusion, but in your introduction, you basically give us a good idea about everything that will come. So for example, again with the same hurricane example, after in paragraph 2 I wanted to write about the wind, then the rain, then the effects. In my first paragraph I would say hurricanes are disastrous, and the two main features of them are the strong winds and the amount of rain. And then I would end by saying, well, not end, but I'll also say the amount of rain and the effects that these two things, two features of the hurricane have on, let me say it was hurricanes in the Caribbean, on the Caribbean. So see, I've talked about everything I plan to talk about later on. So I've told you I'm talking about the two main features of a hurricane, which is the wind and the rain, and the effects them have on the effects the rain and the rain would have on the Caribbean. And that's the three paragraphs, remember, the rain, the rain, and the effects. So that's how you write your introductory paragraph. It's almost a summary, but it's not. It just gives the reader an idea of what is to come. The concluding paragraph, however, is a summary of everything that you would have written about. So it almost starts kind of like the introductory, but instead of listing all the points, you say it was the conclusion of the writing itself. So, for example, if the topic of the writing was hurricanes and their effect on the Caribbean, then your conclusion would probably say, because of the amount, the strong, the high winds and the amount of rain that hurricanes bring, it causes a huge effect on the Caribbean, and every year government has to spend a lot of money replacing infrastructure and water, I don't know, fixing because of power outages and water outages or whatever. And that's how you would end it, because you would say, what is that effect? You can answer the question that was in the topic. Or if it was a compare and contrast, you can give your almost opinion in the thing, saying that after compare and contrast, this is the result. So the conclusion is always about the result, the ending. After you say all of this, what does it really mean, or what you get from it? All right. So I basically say everything in the last 2 points here is saying. So the introduction should give the reader full understanding about what is come in the rest of the writings, and lastly, the concluding paragraph should sum up everything that was said and bring home your points. That is beautifully put. Edit the essay. I think this was the final step. So there's a lot to this step, but I just put as many in there that I thought was most important, I guess. So this is a simple but comprehensive check to make sure that everything is in order. So after reading over, you ask yourself questions like, and reading over is just to fix the grammar, okay? Like any mistakes that you have made. But then you want to ask yourself questions like, did I develop the argument well? And if you could say to yourself, yes, I talk about the wind, I talk about the rain, and then I talk about the effects, and then I conclude. Yes, my argument was well developed. Are your transitions smooth? Yes, I use words like similarly, therefore, as a result of. My paragraph got topic sentences. My transitions was good. It flows when I read it. Then you ask yourself, do they make sense, the transitions? So for example, suppose I was talking about the rain, and then when I start talking about the rain, I say similarly. I use that transition word. Similarly, how you mean similarly? You were just talking about the rain, you say similarly. Unless you're saying similarly, the rain causes a lot of damage, then it makes sense. But you can't use the word similarly and talk about two different things. So you would have to say however, or as well as, or in addition. Actually, that's still kind of agreeing, but however is the best word I just use. Please use however. But that's what I mean when I say, do they make sense? Also check the word limit. You do get penalized a little bit, well not a little bit, a fair amount for a word limit. So if the word limit was 400 and you went over by 425, what I would always advise a student is to write an essay that's under the word limit, right? That they think has in everything, it was done well, instead of trying to stretch it to make the word limit. It usually is a very bad idea to stretch something to make the word limit. If you really do think that you had in everything, it was comprehensive, you answer all the questions, you develop your points well, it flows, everything is good, but you're not making the word limit, I would say by about, at your stage, I would say by about 50 words. If you're just 50 short, I would say leave that essay rather than trying to stretch it, and then there's a disconnect in the points and stuff that you made, and you could tell that it was a little drawn out. I prefer that rather than an essay that met the word limit, or met the word count, sorry. Now the word limit, usually what people, when they're correcting your work, what they would do is that after you pass the word limit, they don't read nothing after that. So if you got 50 and 100 words over the word limit, my advice is cut it down at least to 25, because then that whole 50, 100 words that they're not gonna read, more than likely that is your entire conclusion. And without a conclusion, you could as well not have written an essay. Alright? So be very cognizant of the word limit as well. And also check the vocabulary and the grammar and stuff like that, and etc. Because there are a lot of questions you can ask yourself when looking back. But these to me are important. And I also like to make note of this too. Make sure that the big words that you use don't just sound pretty. Like they weren't just used to sound good. Make sure that they actually flow and make sense. A lot of times children is say, oh, I write an academic piece and is use all these big words and feel fancy. Truth is, I like to do the same thing too. I like to use big words, but just make sure that they make sense. Alright? And we have reached the end of chapter 3.